What if I told you that within the first 30 seconds of meeting someone, you could uncover their deepest fears, hidden motivations, and even predict how they'll behave in high-stress situations? You'd probably think I was selling you some pseudo-scientific nonsense, right? But here's the thing. This isn't about reading palms or crystal balls. This is about understanding the human psyche through the revolutionary insights of Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology. Jung spent decades studying the human mind, and what he discovered will fundamentally change how you see every person you encounter. He identified 18 psychological truths that act like a master key to human behavior. These aren't just academic theories gathering dust in university libraries. They're practical tools that can transform your relationships, career, and entire understanding of human nature. Think about the last time someone surprised you with their behavior. Maybe a colleague you thought was confident suddenly crumbled under pressure. Or perhaps someone you dismissed as boring revealed unexpected depths of creativity. Jung would tell you that these weren't surprises at all. They were predictable patterns that you simply hadn't learned to recognize yet. Today, we're going to change that. We're going to dive deep into Jung's most powerful insights about human psychology. And by the end of this video, you'll possess a skill set that most people spend years trying to develop. You'll understand why that person who seems overly friendly might actually be hiding deep insecurities. Why the quiet person in the corner might be the most dangerous person in the room. And why understanding someone's shadow side is the key to truly knowing them. But before we begin, let me warn you, once you learn to see people through Jung's lens, you can't unsee it. These insights will follow you into every conversation, every relationship, every interaction you have. You'll start noticing patterns everywhere, understanding the hidden dynamics that drive human behavior. Some might call this a superpower. Others might find it overwhelming. Either way, your life is about to become much more interesting. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This quote encapsulates something profound. We're not just learning to read others today, we're also learning to read ourselves. Because here's Jung's first psychological truth. Most of what we think we know about people, including ourselves, is wrong. Let's start with projection. One of Jung's most fundamental concepts. Every single day, you're walking around projecting your own unconscious thoughts, feelings, and motivations onto other people. When you instantly dislike someone you've just met, Jung would ask you to examine what qualities in that person mirror something you're uncomfortable with in yourself. That person who seems fake to you, they might actually be reflecting your own struggles with authenticity. Jung discovered that we tend to hate in others what we haven't accepted in ourselves. This is why the most judgmental people are often the ones struggling most with their own perceived flaws. The person who constantly calls others lazy might be battling their own work ethic issues. The individual who's always pointing out others' dishonesty might be wrestling with their own relationship with truth. But projection doesn't just work negatively. We also project our positive qualities onto others, often idealizing people who embody traits we wish we possessed. Think about your heroes, the people you admire most. Jung would argue that you're not admiring something foreign to you. You're recognizing potential within yourself that you haven't fully developed yet. This brings us to Jung's concept of the persona, which he described as the mask we wear. In social situations, everyone you meet is wearing a persona, a carefully constructed identity designed to make a particular impression. The challenge is learning to see beyond this mask to the real person underneath. Jung observed that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. This is crucial for reading people accurately. The louder someone proclaims their virtues, the more likely they are to be compensating for perceived deficiencies in those areas. The person who constantly talks about their honesty might be struggling with truthfulness. The individual who repeatedly mentions how humble they are probably battles with pride. But here's where it gets really interesting. Most people aren't consciously aware they're wearing a persona. They've identified so completely with their mask that they've forgotten there's a real person underneath. This is why authentic moments are so powerful and memorable. When someone drops their persona, even briefly, we feel like we're seeing their true self, and that creates a deep sense of connection. So how do you spot when someone's persona is slipping? Watch for moments of stress, surprise, or intense emotion. These are the times when the mask tends to fall away, revealing glimpses of the authentic self beneath. Notice what happens when someone thinks they're not being observed, or when they're dealing with unexpected challenges. These moments are windows into their true character. Jung's third psychological truth involves what he called the shadow, perhaps his most important and misunderstood concept. Jung defined the shadow as the person you would rather not be. It's composed of all the traits, impulses, and aspects of personality that we've rejected or repressed, because they don't fit with our self-image or social expectations. Here's what most people don't understand about the shadow. It's not evil, it's simply human. Your shadow contains not just your capacity for selfishness or cruelty, but also positive qualities you've disowned. Maybe you've repressed your creativity because you were told it wasn't practical, or you've hidden your sensitivity because you were taught it was weakness. The shadow reveals itself in several predictable ways. First, through what Jung called shadow projection, we tend to see our own shadow qualities in others, often with strong emotional reactions. If someone's behavior triggers intense anger or disgust in you, ask yourself what aspect of your own shadow they might be reflecting. Second, the shadow appears in our slips of the tongue, our dreams, and our behavior when we're tired, stressed, or intoxicated. These are the moments when our psychological defenses are down, and our repressed aspects have a chance to emerge. Third, you can identify someone's shadow by paying attention to what they protest against most vehemently, the things we rail against. In society, the behaviors we find most deplorable often represent aspects of our own shadow that we're desperate to distance ourselves from. Understanding someone's shadow gives you incredible insight into their psychology. The person who's obsessed with moral purity might be hiding a capacity for moral compromise. The individual who constantly criticizes others for being attention-seeking might be struggling with their own need for recognition. But here's Jung's crucial insight: integrating the shadow, rather than repressing it, is essential for psychological health and authenticity. People who have done shadow work, who've acknowledged and integrated their darker aspects, tend to be more balanced, less judgmental, and paradoxically, more trustworthy. They're not pretending to be perfect, so they don't have to maintain an exhausting facade. Jung's fourth truth centers on his famous theory of psychological types, which later influenced the Myers-Briggs personality test. Jung identified two basic attitude types, introverts and extroverts, but his definitions were far more nuanced than popular culture suggests. For Jung, introversion and extroversion weren't about being shy or outgoing. They were about where you direct your psychological energy. Introverts direct their energy inward, toward their own thoughts, feelings, and inner world. Extroverts direct their energy outward, toward the external world of people, objects, and activities. This has profound implications for reading people. An introvert who seems quiet and withdrawn isn't necessarily shy. They might be deeply engaged with their inner world, processing information in a rich, complex way. An extrovert who's constantly talking and socializing isn't necessarily confident. They might be avoiding their inner world because it feels uncomfortable or overwhelming. Jung also identified for psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Every person has access to all four functions, but typically develops one as their dominant function and another as their auxiliary function. The other two functions remain relatively undeveloped and often show up as sources of difficulty or projection. Understanding someone's dominant function gives you insight into how they make decisions and perceive the world. Thinking types prioritize logic and objective analysis. Feeling types prioritize values and the impact on people. Sensing types focus on concrete, immediate reality. Intuitive types focus on possibilities and patterns. But here's the key insight: people's inferior functions, the ones they've least developed, often become sources of projection and shadow material. A strong thinking type might project their undeveloped feeling function onto others, becoming critical of people who make decisions based on emotions. A dominant sensing type might be uncomfortable with intuitive insights, dismissing them as impractical or unrealistic. Jung's fifth psychological truth involves what he called complexes, autonomous groups of feelings, thoughts, and memories that operate somewhat independently of conscious control. Everyone has complexes, and they're not necessarily pathological. They're simply areas of our psyche where we have heightened emotional sensitivity. You can identify someone's complexes by paying attention to topics or situations that trigger disproportionate emotional reactions. When someone gets unusually angry, defensive, or upset about something that seems relatively minor, they've likely hit a complex. These are psychological sore spots that contain unresolved emotional material. Understanding someone's complexes gives you valuable insight into their psychology and helps you navigate relationships more skillfully. If you know that someone has a complex around authority figures, you can adjust your communication style when you need to give them feedback or direction. If someone has a complex around abandonment, you can be more careful about how you communicate your boundaries or need for space. Jung observed that a complex can be really overcome only if it is lived out to the full. This means that trying to avoid or suppress complexes usually backfires. The healthiest people aren't those without complexes, but those who are aware of their complexes and have learned to work with them constructively. The sixth truth involves Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, rather than who you think you should be or who others expect you to be. Jung saw individuation as the central task of adult psychological development, and understanding where someone is in this process gives you crucial insight into their behavior and motivations. People in the early stages of individuation are often heavily identified with their persona and are primarily concerned with meeting external expectations and achieving conventional success. They might seem confident and together on the surface, but they often experience a sense of emptiness or meaninglessness because they're not living authentically. Those in the middle stages of individuation are often dealing with what Jung called the midlife crisis, though it doesn't always happen at midlife. This is when people begin to question their previous assumptions about life and start exploring aspects of themselves they've previously ignored or rejected. This stage can be tumultuous and confusing, but it's a necessary part of psychological growth. People in the later stages of individuation have begun to integrate their various psychological aspects and are living more authentically. They're less concerned with external validation and more focused on being true to their own values and nature. They've often done significant shadow work and are more accepting of both their own and others' imperfections. Understanding where someone is in their individuation process helps you understand their priorities, fears, and motivations. Someone early in the process might be primarily motivated by external success and approval. Someone in the middle stages might seem to be going through an identity crisis. Someone in the later stages might seem more relaxed about conventional achievements but more passionate about meaningful work or relationships. Jung's seventh truth involves the anima and animus, the unconscious feminine aspect in men, anima, and the unconscious masculine aspect in women, animus. Before you dismiss this as outdated gender stereotyping, understand that Jung was talking about psychological principles, not biological gender roles. The anima represents qualities traditionally associated with femininity, receptivity, intuition, emotion, and connection. The animus represents qualities traditionally associated with masculinity, action, logic, assertion, and independence. Everyone, regardless of gender, contains both principles, but one is typically more conscious and developed, while the other remains largely unconscious. When someone's anima or animus is undeveloped or projected, it creates predictable patterns. A man who hasn't integrated his anima might project it onto women, expecting them to carry all the emotional and intuitive functions in his relationships. A woman who hasn't integrated her animus might project it onto men, expecting them to make all the decisions and take all the action. You can spot anima and animus projections by watching how someone relates to the opposite gender. Do they idealize or demonize people of the opposite sex? Do they seem to expect opposite gender people to fulfill certain roles or functions? Do they become particularly emotional or irrational when dealing with certain gendered expectations? People who have integrated their anima and animus tend to be more psychologically balanced and complete. They're comfortable with both their receptive and active qualities, their emotional and logical sides. They don't need to project these qualities onto others because they've developed them within themselves. The eighth psychological truth involves what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to reveal an underlying order or purpose in life. While this might seem mystical, Jung was actually pointing to something important about human psychology and perception. People who are more aware of synchronicity tend to be more intuitive and open to non-linear ways of understanding the world. They notice patterns and connections that others might miss. They're often more creative and flexible in their thinking, On the other hand, people who dismiss synchronicity entirely might be overly reliant on logical, linear thinking and might miss important subtleties in their environment. Understanding someone's relationship to synchronicity gives you insight into their cognitive style and openness to experience. Someone who's constantly talking about meaningful coincidences might be highly intuitive, but possibly lacking in practical grounding. Someone who dismisses all such experiences might be very grounded in reality, but possibly missing important contextual information. Jung's ninth truth involves the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of unconscious material that we share with all humanity. This contains what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns or themes that appear across cultures and throughout history. Understanding archetypes helps you read people because we all embody various archetypal patterns at different times. Someone might be operating from the mother archetype, exhibiting nurturing, protective behaviors. Another person might be expressing the warrior archetype, showing courage, determination, and a willingness to fight for what they believe in. Hero archetype appears when someone is embarking on a challenging journey or quest. The sage archetype emerges when someone is seeking or sharing wisdom. The lover archetype manifests in people who are passionate, emotionally expressive, and focused on connection and beauty. Recognizing which archetypal energy someone is embodying helps you understand their motivations and predict their behavior. Someone operating from the caregiver archetype will prioritize others' needs, sometimes to their own detriment. Someone expressing the rebel archetype will resist authority and conventional expectations. But here's the crucial insight. Archetypal energies can be expressed in both healthy and unhealthy ways. The mother archetype can manifest as genuine nurturing or as smothering control. The warrior can appear as courageous action or as destructive aggression. Understanding both the light and shadow aspects of archetypes helps you read people more accurately. Jung's 10th truth involves what he called the transcendent function, the psychological process that bridges conscious and unconscious material. This is essentially the mechanism by which we integrate different aspects of our personality and achieve greater psychological wholeness. People who have developed their transcendent function tend to be more psychologically integrated and flexible. They can hold contradictions and paradoxes without becoming anxious or defensive. They're comfortable with ambiguity and can see multiple perspectives on complex issues. You can recognize someone with a well-developed transcendent function by their ability to remain calm in the face of conflicting information or competing demands. They don't rush to judge or categorize experiences that don't fit their existing frameworks. They're curious about their own reactions and willing to examine their assumptions. On the other hand, people with an underdeveloped transcendent function tend to be more rigid and black and white in their thinking. They become anxious when faced with contradictions and quickly resort to either-or thinking. They might be very certain about their beliefs and opinions, but struggle when reality doesn't match their expectations. The 11th psychological truth involves Jung's understanding of the relationship between conscious and unconscious material. Jung observed that whatever is excluded from consciousness doesn't disappear. It goes underground and continues to influence behavior from the unconscious level. This has profound implications for reading people. Often, the qualities someone most strongly denies possessing are the ones that are most powerfully influencing their behavior from the unconscious level. The person who insists they never get angry might be constantly irritated, but expressing it indirectly through passive-aggressive behavior. The individual who claims to be completely selfless might be manipulating others to meet their own needs for appreciation and control. Jung noted that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. People who are more aware of their unconscious patterns have more choice in their behavior. They can recognize when they're being triggered and choose how to respond rather than simply reacting automatically. You can assess someone's level of self-awareness by paying attention to how accurately they can predict their own behavior and emotional reactions. People with good self-awareness rarely surprise themselves with their responses to situations. They understand their patterns and can anticipate their likely reactions to different circumstances. The 12th truth involves Jung's concept of compensation, the unconscious tendency to balance conscious attitudes with their opposite. If someone's conscious attitude is extremely one-sided, their unconscious will often compensate by developing the opposite quality. This is why people sometimes act in ways that seem completely contrary to their usual personality. The person who's always controlled and rational might occasionally have explosive emotional outbursts. The individual who's typically pessimistic might sometimes display surprising optimism. These aren't random personality quirks, they're compensatory mechanisms trying to restore psychological balance. Understanding compensation helps you predict when someone might act against type. Look for areas where someone's conscious attitude is extremely rigid or one-sided. These are the areas where compensatory reactions are most likely to occur. The stronger the conscious position, the more powerful the unconscious compensation tends to be. Jung's 13th truth involves the relationship between thinking and feeling, 2 of his 4 psychological functions. Jung observed that these functions tend to be opposed to each other. When one is highly developed, the other often remains relatively unconscious and primitive. People with highly developed thinking functions tend to make decisions based on logic, objective analysis, and impersonal criteria. They're often good at seeing flaws in arguments and maintaining emotional detachment. However, their feeling function might be undeveloped, leading them to struggle with understanding emotional dynamics or making decisions that take personal values into account. Conversely, people with highly developed feeling functions make decisions based on personal values, the impact on people, and what feels right. They're often good at understanding emotional undercurrents and maintaining harmony. In relationships, however, their thinking function might be undeveloped, leading them to struggle with objective analysis or logical problem solving. The key insight is that people tend to project their inferior function onto others. Strong thinking types might dismiss feeling types as irrational or overly emotional. Strong feeling types might view thinking types as cold or insensitive. Understanding this dynamic helps you navigate conflicts and communicate more effectively with people who operate from a different functional preference. The 14th psychological truth involves Jung's understanding of the relationship between sensing and intuition, the other pair of opposing functions. Sensing types focus on concrete, immediate reality, what they can see, hear, touch, and directly experience. Intuitive types focus on possibilities, patterns, and potential, what might be, what could happen, what the deeper meaning might be. Sensing types tend to be practical, detail-oriented, and focused on the present moment. They're often good at managing day-to-day realities and dealing with concrete problems. However, they might struggle with long-term planning or seeing the bigger picture. They might dismiss intuitive insights as impractical or unrealistic. Intuitive types tend to be imaginative, future-oriented, and focused on possibilities. They're often good at seeing patterns and potential that others miss. However, they might struggle with practical details or present moment awareness. They might become impatient with routine tasks or concrete limitations. Again, the key insight is that people tend to project their inferior function. Strong sensing types might view intuitive types as impractical dreamers. Strong intuitive types might see sensing types as narrow-minded or lacking in vision. Understanding this dynamic helps you appreciate different cognitive styles and communicate more effectively across these differences. Jung's 15th truth involves what he called the stages of life. Recognizing that different psychological tasks and challenges are appropriate at different life stages. The first half of life, roughly up to age 35 or 40, is typically focused on establishing oneself in the world, developing a career, forming relationships, building a family, achieving social recognition. During this stage, people are often highly identified with their persona and focused on meeting external expectations. They derive their sense of identity and worth primarily from external achievements and social roles. This is psychologically appropriate for this life stage, but problems arise when people remain stuck in this orientation beyond its natural time. The second half of life involves a shift toward more internal concerns, finding meaning and purpose, developing spirituality, integrating rejected aspects of personality, and preparing for mortality. People in this stage often experience what Jung called the afternoon of life, a time when external achievements feel less satisfying and internal development becomes more important. Understanding which life stage someone is in helps you understand their priorities and motivations. Someone in the first half of life might be primarily motivated by career advancement and social success. Someone in the second half might be more interested in meaningful work, personal growth, and leaving a legacy. The 16th psychological truth involves Jung's concept of psychological energy and how it flows within the personality. Jung observed that psychological energy, like physical energy, tends to flow toward areas of least resistance. When we encounter obstacles or conflicts, energy can become blocked or redirected in unexpected ways. This is why people sometimes develop symptoms or behaviors that seem unrelated to their conscious goals. Someone who's blocked in their career might develop relationship problems. An individual who's suppressing their creativity might experience depression or anxiety. The energy has to go somewhere, and if it can't flow in its natural direction, it will find alternative outlets. Understanding energy flow helps you read people's underlying dynamics. When someone's behavior seems inconsistent with their stated goals, look for areas where their energy might be blocked or redirected. Often, apparent self-sabotage is actually energy trying to flow toward something that's been consciously rejected or suppressed. Jung's 17th truth involves the importance of symbols in psychological life. Jung observed that the unconscious communicates primarily through symbols rather than literal language. Dreams, fantasies, artistic expressions, and even seemingly random associations often contain symbolic messages from the unconscious. People who are more symbolically aware tend to be more creative and intuitive. They notice metaphors and patterns in their experience and can often access wisdom that's not available through purely rational means. They might make decisions based on symbolic guidance or find meaning in seemingly random events. On the other hand, people who are purely literal in their thinking might miss important information that's being communicated symbolically. They might dismiss dreams, artistic expressions, or intuitive insights as meaningless, thereby cutting themselves off from valuable sources of wisdom and guidance. Understanding someone's relationship to symbolic thinking gives you insight into their creativity, intuition, and access to unconscious wisdom. Someone who pays attention to their dreams and finds meaning in synchronistic events is likely more connected to their unconscious than someone who dismisses such experiences as superstition. Finally, Jung's 18th psychological truth involves what he called the religious function of the psyche, the innate human need for meaning, transcendence, and connection to something greater than oneself. Jung observed that this function exists regardless of whether someone is traditionally religious, and that problems often arise when this need is suppressed or misdirected. People who have integrated their religious function in healthy ways tend to have a sense of purpose and meaning that transcends their personal concerns. They might be traditionally religious, or they might find transcendence through art, nature, service to others, or personal growth. The specific form doesn't matter as much as the underlying sense of connection to something meaningful and larger than themselves. Those who have suppressed their religious function might experience existential anxiety, meaninglessness, or a compulsive focus on material achievements that never quite satisfy. They might also project their need for transcendence onto other people, ideologies, or pursuits, leading to fanaticism or addiction. Understanding someone's relationship to meaning and transcendence gives you insight into their deepest motivations and sources of fulfillment. Someone with a well-integrated religious function will likely be motivated by purposes that extend beyond personal gain. Someone who's struggling with meaninglessness might be searching for something to believe in or dedicate themselves to. We reach the end of our exploration of Jung's 18 psychological truths. It's important to remember that reading people accurately requires practice, humility, and ongoing. These insights are tools, not absolute rules, and every individual is unique and complex. The goal isn't to categorize people or reduce them to psychological types, but to develop greater empathy, understanding, and skill in human relationships. As Jung himself noted, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When you truly understand someone, when you can see beyond their persona to their authentic self, when you can recognize their shadow without judgment, when you can appreciate their unique psychological structure, you create the possibility for genuine connection and mutual growth. These 18 truths are not just about reading others, they're also about understanding yourself more deeply. As you develop your ability to see psychological patterns in others, you'll inevitably become more aware of your own patterns, projections, and unconscious dynamics. Jung believed that consciousness and self-awareness were humanity's greatest achievements and responsibilities. By learning to read people more accurately and compassionately, you're participating in this great work of bringing light to the unconscious patterns that govern human behavior. Remember, the goal is not to manipulate or control others, but to understand and connect more deeply. Use these insights with wisdom, compassion, and respect for the profound complexity and dignity of every human being you encounter. In doing so, you'll not only become better at reading others, you'll become more fully human yourself.